Hi, welcome back to Healthy Families, brought to you by Healthy Food Guide, the podcast where we explore practical tips and expert advice to help families eat well through every stage of life. I'm Kathleen Alleaume.
And I'm Jess Burvill. Now, on today's episode, we'll be delving into a question that was sent in to us by one of our listeners, which is, what's the best way to fuel exercise? So whether you're an average gym goer or training for your first half marathon, or perhaps you're an up-and-coming superstar on your school basketball team, we've got you covered.
And for our wrap-up segment today, we're going to unpack the hot topic of whether it is better to exercise in a fasted or fed state.
Looking forward to getting stuck into that question. Now, let's kick off by talking about exercise and why it's important for health. Now, exercise has to be the best natural medicine. It's good for our mood and uplifting our mental health, lowers our risk of developing lots of conditions like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and even some types of cancer like bowel cancer. Exercise helps to maintain our blood glucose levels and to lower cholesterol and blood pressure. And it also helps to maintain strong muscles and bones and protect our joints right throughout life. It's important for weight control, particularly as we start to get a little bit older, and it also keeps our brain sharp and preventing cognitive decline. And importantly, it helps us to sleep well at night. Have I missed anything there, Kath?
What can't exercise do? It's medicine.
It really is.
So how much do we need? That is the question. So I think the general guidelines throughout all ages, even though, example, toddlers will need at least 3 hours of active play every day, through to adults, we're looking at around 60 minutes every day. But I think the general recommendation is what I recommend is exercising, and maybe not even using that word, physical activity, moving your body on most days of the week. Now, this can vary anywhere between moderate intensity to ideally more intense exercise on, every odd day, but also breaking that up with a couple of days a week of some strength training. Now, for the littlies, of course, that doesn't mean going to the gym. It means anything from climbing to monkey barring or doing some lunges, any functional kind of movement. And then, yes, if you're doing any strength training like plyometrics or lifting weights, that's ideal as you get older. But the idea is moving on most days of the week. Now, surveys do show that the majority of us are not achieving those recommendations. And that just means, Jess, that, we're not getting those health benefits that you mentioned.
Yeah, a lot of people missing out on all those wonderful things that exercise can do for our health. Now, before we dive into all those details about, how much and what time I should be eating and what type of food I should be eating, it helps to understand a few of the basic concepts. Now, if we think of our body as being a bit like a car, it needs fuel to perform. Now, we get that fuel from three main nutrients, which are carbs, protein, and fats. And each of those play a different role and are used in slightly different way. Now, carbohydrates are actually our body's preferred source of fuel for most types of exercise, in particular what we call aerobic exercise. So things like running or cycling, those HIIT gym classes, perhaps football or netball, or even those explosive movements that you might do like powerlifting in the gym. And of course, our brain also runs almost exclusively on carbohydrates, so they are super, super important for our body. Now, our body can only actually store a small amount of carbohydrate at any one time, whether that's in our liver or in our muscles or in our blood glucose. So it actually needs to be replaced through food, and we'll come on to talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. Now, next up is protein. Now, we talked about protein in episode 4 for those of you who are listening. Now, protein isn't actually stored in our body for fuel. It's used more for things like building muscles and ligaments and other tissue in our body. Now, there are some circumstances where we might use protein for fuel in exercise. I'll give you a couple of examples, and that might be perhaps somebody who is following an energy-restricted eating pattern where they're not having a lot of carbohydrates in their diet, or perhaps you're doing some really long endurance exercise like a marathon or an ultramarathon runner who's at the end of the event and they've run out of that muscle glycogen and not able to take on board any more fuel. Their body might start turning to their muscles to break them down to use for fuel. But ideally, that's not an ideal scenario. We want to be avoiding that in most circumstances because that can result in unintentional muscle wasting. Now, our last nutrient that can be used for exercise is fat. And unlike carbohydrates and protein, our body can actually store fat and use this fat for fuel in some circumstances. Now, it actually does take longer for our body to break down fat to be used as fuel. So it's not particularly useful if you're doing something high intensity, like a HIIT class at the gym or a really hard run or a bike ride. But if you're doing something a bit easier, like going for a walk or perhaps a Pilates class, then yes, your body can use fat for fuel.
Yeah, and it's worth highlighting there that in order to use that fat as fuel, which, I mean, majority people who are wanting to maintain or achieve a healthy weight, the body also does still need some carbohydrates efficiently to burn that fat. So even though you might be wanting to achieve and maintain a healthy weight, going on a more calorie-restricted eating pattern or trying to curb carbs can actually come to be of detriment, because a little bit of carb does help to kind of metabolize that fat as well.
That's exactly right. Okay, we're going to go to a quick break, but stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Eggs are bad. Eggs are good. Cut carbs, boost carbs. Ugh, with so much conflicting information, what's truly healthy? Healthyfood.com cuts through the noise to deliver credible, science-backed nutrition advice from qualified dietitians to ensure you make the best decisions for your lifestyle. A subscription to healthyfood.com gives you access to thousands of easy, delicious, healthy recipes, meal plans, and more. Visit healthyfood.com to start your journey to better health today.
Now we've covered the fueling basics, let's talk in more detail about the when, the what, and how much. Now, I have to preface by saying that the general guidelines that we're giving today is more for the recreational type activity. So not like your elite athletes, where a more individualized approach is required, so such as getting advice from an accredited sports dietitian.
So let's start off, first of all, by talking about what to have before your workout, or whether you should have something at all. Now, the answer to that question will be determined by things like how long your workout's going to be, how intense it's going to be, and do you have a specific training goal in mind? Now, thinking back to what we were just talking about with your car, your body being like a car needing to have fuel, you've only got enough fuel on board generally to last you for about an hour. So if your training session is going to be longer than, say, an hour or 90 minutes, or it is going to be particularly tough session, say you're going to do a really high intensity workout at the gym or a really hard run, it is generally recommended, and we know from the evidence, that you will perform better and recover better if you do take on board a little bit of fuel before that training session. If your session's going to be shorter or perhaps a bit lower intensity, like a walk or a Pilates class, you probably don't need to take anything on board before that session. It's really down to you whether you decide to do that or not. So, Kath, can you give us some examples of what would be a great snack to have before one of those workouts, say where it is going to be a little bit of a, harder or a longer workout?
Yeah, I think, Jess, as you said, it really does depend on the intensity and the type of workout that you're doing. But generally speaking, you really do want to get the most out of your workout, right? So that's why, even though it may not be for performance, such as an athlete, but you want to get a lot out of your workout. So you still want those carbohydrates. And, the type of carbohydrate and the amount you do will vary, again, on the intensity and the type of exercise you're doing, but trying not to ditch those carbohydrates, because they are the body's preferred source of fuel, and the muscles just love that. And combining that with a little bit of protein is important. So just give you some examples. So a small bowl of cereal with some yogurt or milk, some toast with banana and a drizzle of honey. Again, that's quite carbohydrate rich. Small bowl of pasta with a more tomato-based lighter sauce rather than a creamier meaty sauce. Now, remember when we're talking about pre-exercise, something like a fruit smoothie or just some raisin toast with jam. So, it doesn't have to be quite a heavy meal, but just something that's going to, again, get the most out of your workout. You want a little bit of fuel in the tank.
Yeah, it gives you something for your body to work with. And also remembering that it also depends on how far away your exercise class or your training session is. Like if you've only got half an hour till you're about to start, you want to be keeping those carbohydrates and that meal really, really simple. So kind of on the lower fiber, lower protein, lower fat, really simple carbohydrates. But if you've got a bit more time, say you've got an hour or two, you can have probably a larger amount of food and something a little bit more, balanced and complex.
All right. So what about after exercise? How important is nutrition then?
Yeah, look, post-workout nutrition is particularly important if your exercise has been, of long duration or high intensity, or perhaps you're doing more than one training session in a day, like you're a triathlete. Now, if you don't refuel correctly, a few things can happen. You can end up feeling, basically feeling really tired. So say you've done a workout in the morning and you haven't refueled correctly afterwards, you can find your energy levels right throughout the day can be low, and you might even find yourself nodding off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And same thing goes if you're working out in the evening and you've not refueled correctly. You might find yourself waking up tired and particularly sore the next day. Another thing that can happen is if you're not refueling correctly after intense exercise is that you can force your body to be drawing on its reserves, and that can end up compromising your immune system, leaving you more susceptible to picking up little bugs and becoming sick.
So give us some examples, Jess, like what we talked about in the pre-workout or before you work out, the emphasis on carbohydrates. So is this when we look to more protein when we're talking about post-recovery?
Yeah, post-recovery is a little bit different to pre-workout in that there is emphasis on both carbohydrate and protein. So first of all, carbohydrates are particularly important if you've been doing cardio exercise, like some high-intensity cardio exercise, because what will have happened during your training session is that you will have run down those glycogen stores in your muscles, and that glycogen needs to be replaced, and it can only come from food. So your top priority is making sure that you're getting some good quality carbohydrates in after your workout. Then, as you mentioned, protein comes into play more in the post-workout nutrition. Now, this is because we've actually been using our muscles during our exercise session, and they've become damaged in a certain way. They get micro tears in them, and getting some protein, good quality protein on board in that sort of period after the exercise helps with that repair process. And making sure we're getting enough carbohydrate and protein on board will make sure that you bounce back quickly, and it'll help to reduce some of that muscle soreness that you might be familiar with after you've done a hard training session.
All right. So what if you exercise in the morning versus afternoon? What are some examples of foods that you would do at that combination?
So if you're exercising in the morning, a lot of the typical breakfasts that somebody might eat are going to be actually perfect examples of good post-workout recovery nutrition. So something like a bowl of cereal, which has got your carbohydrate source in it, and you're having that with some milk or yogurt, and that's going to be your source of protein. Something like that is going to be a perfectly adequate post-workout meal. And again, if we're talking about you're exercising in the evening, a lot of, a typical dinner which contains a good source of protein, such as some lean fish or lean meat or chicken, paired with some good carbohydrate, which might be something like a nice whole grain brown rice or quinoa, or perhaps some starchy vegetables like potato, is going to be a really good combination to help refuel and replace the glycogen stores and help repair with those muscles. Now, if your meal is perhaps a couple of hours away, so say you've exercised in the middle of the afternoon and dinner's still 2 or 3 hours away, we would recommend having a snack to get you, to tide you over between the workout and dinner. And again, something really simple like a smoothie, either one you've made at home, like a banana smoothie, or even one you've bought in the shop, is going to be a good option because it's got that nice combination of carbs and protein.
Yeah, or even things like fruit with crackers, or like yogurt with some nuts maybe, or you've got, maybe some muesli bars or nut bars. I mean, anything really that's convenient, just that little snack to tide you over. Yeah,
you don't need to be buying, special sport nutrition products unless you are an elite athlete and perhaps you need something portable that's got higher concentration of nutrients in it. But for the everyday athlete, everyday food, normal food that you can buy in the shops or that you've got at home is going to be perfectly adequate.
Speaking of snacks, though, one thing I often get asked about is what to feed the kids, particularly after that school period, because chances are they're going to be going to another activity around 4 or 5 o'clock. So you're thinking around that 3 o'clock mark when usually they're quite hungry and you want to be able to fuel them. Now, potentially I'm talking about more pre-fueling again. And then, of course, it goes into what you're going to feed them after the sport too. So both of those guidelines really come at play here. So, for example, with my children, I've got primary school age children, I've got one high school. So, they're finishing at around 3:30 and they're coming home and they've all got sports and extracurricular activities to attend. One in particular does 4 hours of sports, so that she's not finishing until 8 o'clock at night. So for her, it's going to be like a reverse type dinner. So I often give her something around 4 o'clock, which is quite substantial, and then I'll be giving her like a light snack. So I think if we're talking about feeding the family here, I think it's really important. I mean, yes, whilst we talk about that combination of protein and carbohydrates, it's really being really prepared here, because this is a really hard time for parents, that time where you finish school, you've got to get them to their after school sports, what to feed them. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go and feed them different meals and different snacks or whatever it may be. I think prep is your friend here. So I'll give you an example. If I'm going to give my child who is training for 4 hours a pasta meal, and I'm going to give her that at 4 o'clock, that's technically her dinner. But then for the other child who's coming home at 6 o'clock, that's going to be a reheated version of that dinner. So it's really kind of planning out how you're going to distribute that and what time you're giving it to them. So one might have a snack, a later dinner, or one might have an earlier dinner and a snack. Now for the teenager in my house who might be potentially coming home and doing some study after, refueling for him is really important, particularly after he plays football for a couple of hours, coming home and making sure he's having a really good dinner with that combination, and he's going to be having that fuel, particularly for his brain, to study for another couple of hours, if he does study, so he does, study for a couple more hours later. So, I mean, again, it's just looking at schedules. I mean, we talk about nutrition, absolutely, but the obstacle that gets in many people's way, particularly with very busy families, is what are the obstacles for refueling correctly? And often it's time, coordinating different activities, and just having that little planning in play really does. Because like a basic dinner of, like you said, Jess, spaghetti bowl, stir fries, all those things are really good options for post-recovery. It's the timing that you're giving it as well.
Yeah, that's really good advice, Kathleen. Like really thinking about that practical application of how you make it work for you and removing some of those barriers to making sure you're getting that great nutrition in after your exercise.
Okay, we're going to take a break now, but don't go away because there's plenty more.
At Sanitarium Health Food Company, we're on a mission to make healthy eating easier. From grab-and-go brekkies to clever snack ideas and budget-friendly dinners, our plant-powered recipes have you covered. At sanitarium.com, download our free 12 before 12 cookbook. It's a fun food adventure that teaches kids skills for a healthier life. And whether you're feeding toddlers or fueling teenagers, helpful nutrition advice is just a click away. Sanitarium. Eat well, live well.
All right, so let's move on to hydration. Now, that is really also important. I mean, not only pre-workout, post-workout, but during your exercise session. And again, it comes down to intensity and how long you're working out for. But when do sports drinks come into play? Look, we know water is the best thirst quencher and the best rehydration fluid. But when do sports drinks? When would you recommend a sports drink?
Yeah, look, staying hydrated during sport is very important, and we know from the evidence that even a slight amount of dehydration, as little as 1 or 2%, can actually have a big impact on your performance. Now, what happens when we're exercising is that, of course, we sweat. It's our body's way of cooling us down, and we sweat more when the weather is hotter or it's more humid, or perhaps you're doing a longer or a higher intensity exercise session. I mean, we all know that during summer we sweat more than during winter. And what happens when we sweat is that we lose electrolytes. Now, electrolytes are minerals that our body needs for all sorts of different important functions. And once they're lost, they do need to be replaced. Now, this is where sport drinks can come in quite handy, because sports drinks contain a combination of both carbohydrate, which is useful for replacing energy stores, but they also contain electrolytes such as sodium, potassium, and magnesium. So generally speaking, whilst most people can meet their hydration requirements through tap water alone, if you are doing a longer or harder training session, or it's in particularly hot or humid weather, that would be a couple of situations where electrolyte sports drink may be suitable and appropriate.
I always say the proof is in the pee as well, because one way of telling that you are hydrated enough is just by looking at the colour of your urine. And I know that's not the best thing to talk about, but if it's pale, you're doing well. If it's yellow, maybe you need to drink a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about what you're drinking throughout the day. So when you're starting that training session, you're already well hydrated. And the other thing to point out is that there are electrolytes in the food we eat as well. So this is where that meal we have post our exercise session comes into play again, because you can actually replace some of those lost electrolytes just through the food you're eating. It doesn't all need to come from the fluids.
Speaking of fluids, you often see a lot of people putting protein powders in their fluid, whether that be water or milk. What's your take on those?
Yeah, we talked about protein in episode 4, didn't we? And look, for some people, protein supplements, such as a protein powder, can be helpful and a convenient way to meet their protein requirements. But if we're talking about, again, the general population, kids and teenagers, most people are going to be able to meet their protein requirements very easily through the food that they're eating. I mean, if someone's an elite athlete, or perhaps they're trying to gain muscle mass, they might have additional requirements. But for the everyday person and recreational athlete, no, proteins, powders and supplements are not required. And really, if someone is having a protein powder and they're using that in place of perhaps food, they're potentially going to be displacing other more important nutrients from their food. So we would always at Healthy Food Guide encourage people to get, the majority of your protein sources and requirements through whole natural foods.
And we know for a fact that kids and teenagers aren't eating enough fruits and vegetables anyway. So we really want to look to the whole foods to get those protein and, of course, the combination of carbohydrates and all those other vitamins and minerals that you suggested. Okay, let's now wrap it up with our myth-busting segment. And we said the question of today is whether it's good to exercise in a fasted or fed state. Jess, what's the research say? Give us the research wrap-up on this.
So look, the research tells us that if fat loss is your goal, then no, there is no real benefit to training fasted versus fed. So yes, whilst your body will use more fat than carbohydrate during exercise if you do it in a fasted state, this doesn't necessarily translate to fat loss. And when we look at why that's the case, we need to think about the notion that's behind fat loss, which is that you need to be in a calorie deficit over a sustained period of time. So we're looking at what you're doing over the days and the weeks and the months and the total amount of kilojoules you're burning during your exercise, rather than whether you ate before or after your training session. So if you think about it, a good example would be, so somebody could go out and do a really easy walk, and they've done that fasted because they're trying to burn more fat. So they might have burned a certain number of calories and fat during that training session, versus the person that had a small snack before their session and then went out and did a quite high intensity session. If you look at who burned more kilojoules across the session, it's likely to be the person that had the snack and did the harder exercise session there. So that's actually going to be making a greater contribution to fat loss than the person who exercised fasted.
Yeah, because the overall calorie burn is higher. So I think that's where people make many mistakes, thinking that I'm not going to eat, I'm going to burn up more fat stores instead in my exercise. And again, depending on the duration of your exercise and the intensity, but if you're going in there quite a little bit hungry and you're not going to perform to an intense level, the actual post-caloric oxidation after you exercise is not going to be as high. So as that example you mentioned before, Jess, so someone who is exercising at a higher intensity is in fact burning a lot more overall calories as a result of that session, as opposed to someone who's going more of a mediocre walk and hadn't had anything to eat. Now, another thing to layer on top of that is for that person who hadn't eaten something and then exercised, probably gets really hungry later, and sometimes the choices aren't as good. So you kind of got to work out what's working in your favor, what goals you're doing, what's your goal of exercising, what duration are you working at, certainly the intensity, but sometimes having that little bit of snack beforehand is going to make you work that harder because you want to get the most out of your workout and potentially the overall calorie burn, which is what you want to achieve and maintain that healthy weight.
Well, that's it for today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do like and share it with your friends and family. We look forward to seeing you next time on Healthy Families, brought to you by Healthy Food Guide. Bye.